What's up, guys, and welcome to this video. So today we're going to talk about the Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator. And I know for most people, especially if you're new to Azure, it can be a little bit smoke and mirrors trying to anticipate what your Azure spend will be on a month-to-month basis. And this can be especially challenging if you're trying to put together a new quote or proposal. So that's kind of where our Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator comes in. This tool basically will allow you to compile all your expenses in one coherent report that includes things like Office, licensing, virtual machine month to month, whether you're going to do reserved instance or Azure hybrid usage, and then also the Nerdio cost that's going to be associated with the user count. So what we're going to do, guys, is in this video we will walk through the NFA cost estimator pretty much line by line, and I'm going to explain each section in detail. And after this video, you should feel pretty empowered to quote just about any opportunity totally on your own. Alright, so with that, let's get started. Alright, so there are two different ways of locating the Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator. If you are already a signed partner or a trial partner, you should have a Nerdio admin portal login. What you'll do, you'll just log into the Nerdio admin portal. You should see something like this page right here, and it'll just show all the different accounts you have. If you've got a trial account, probably just show this default WinHeart, but this would just be the general accounts page. What you do is you go to Billing, then Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator, and that will bring you to our cost estimator page. Now, if you have not signed up for Nerdio yet and you do not have a trial account, you can just go to getnerdio.com, and then what you'll do is you'll select this Azure Cost Estimator, and it'll provide the option for you there as well. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and do it based on the enterprise SKU. There are some distinguishing factors between core and enterprise, and the primary one is the user count, right? So with core, being that it's billed on a flat rate of $56 per month, obviously the number of users is irrelevant. And then also with core, you don't have the ability to do dedicated desktops or pooled desktops, so any information about that in the cost estimator is also removed. So you can see if I select that, the whole section just goes, disappears. So a good thing is most of the stuff, if it's going to be covered in enterprise, it'll also be covered in core. It's just stuff that's removed for core. But if there are any distinguishing factors there throughout this tutorial, I'll go ahead and just point them out to you. So starting out, let's go ahead and load up some information about the environment. I'll say there are 100 users, and then the next tab here asks, are you going to load with a WVD or an RDS environment? And I've had people say, hey, just as a brief summary, what's the difference between RDS and WVD, and are there any situations where a partner might actually use the RDS or deploy with RDS versus WVD? And as just a very brief summary, I'd say, as an example of the differences between the two, just kind of look at the difference between like maybe Windows Vista and Windows 7, or Windows 7 and Windows 10, right? Windows Vista to Windows 7 was kind of the old thing. Once Windows 7 came out, Microsoft really migrated people away from Vista, and they discontinued Vista, and the same thing with Windows 7 and Windows 10. Now I'm not saying they're going to discontinue RDS, but WVD is definitely what they're pushing people towards. It not only reduces overall infrastructure, but also simplifies a lot of the licensing that comes into play. So what I would find, and what I highly recommend, is go with WVD. Now there are situations where I've seen people stick with RDS, and the two primary cases there tend to be in situation A, where maybe they have an internal application that was developed specifically for their environment, and it's designed to integrate with Server 2012, and it's really meant for an RDS environment. Given that, I would say, yeah, it's probably not worth the pain of upgrading to WVD and then having the developers go and redesign the application to make sure it integrates with Windows 10 natively. The other side of the coin there is the other situation I see partners stay with RDS is if they've been in the RDS environment for years and years and years, and they just really aren't interested in learning the differences between RDS and WVD. From my own personal experience, WVD really simplifies things, and if you understand RDS, it's really not very hard to understand what Microsoft changed for WVD to help smooth things out a little bit. So I see that a lot less often, but it has come up in the past where partners say, hey, I just rather stick with RDS because it's what I know. And in that case, obviously that's what they ran with. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and stick with WVD, and we'll go ahead and continue the tutorial based on that. Now, the next section here, will any of the users need dedicated personal desktops? What we find is Oftentimes people think they need this more than they actually do. Just for a brief overview, dedicated desktop is basically the same as what a VDI desktop, for instance, in an RDS environment. It's really just a virtual machine with all of its resources dedicated to a single user, whereas a pool is maybe multiple virtual machines, and each virtual machine has several users sharing the resources of that VM. So some of the challenges obviously would be that if the virtual machine is maybe under allocated for the resource consumption that's the users are leveraging on that virtual machine, then they'll max it out, and you might have some latency or performance issues. And we have partners who say, hey, we've got a CEO of this company, we just cannot afford for them to experience any latency in this cloud environment, so we're going to give them a dedicated desktop. Now, what we find is, as long as you have the VM series size set correctly, it's very rare that you'll experience latency, and it would only be during peak hours, and maybe if users are doing a little bit above and beyond what they would normally do in their environment. Maybe they've got more tabs open and they've got several different applications running in the background, and they end up maxing out some of the resources on the VM. But overall, Microsoft has done a great job of helping you to set those rules to make sure that you don't experience latency. But for the sake of argument, I'll go ahead and just add maybe 10 dedicated desktops in here alongside the pooled desktops. But again, in most cases, we find that it's really not necessary. As another option, you could also add, if you've got graphic intensive desktop needs. This is more of a rare use case, but if you did need this, that's an option for you. What it's going to do then is say, all right, we're going to subtract these two numbers from the total number, and we'll assume everybody else would be on the pooled desktop. Something to keep in mind though, when you set this number, go ahead and scroll down to section 5 and then the beginning of section 6. So you'll see this at the end of section 5 here. This is the pool logic. What it talks about is how many session hosts are going to be maintained in the environment, and then what are the series size going to be on those session hosts. And then we also have some information here. So I'll go through this in more detail in a second, but what I want you to look at right off the bat is this number right here, right? So you need to, this tab rather, you need to specify professional worker right before you get started. Pro workers are basically your standard environment workers. So these are going to be users who are maybe leveraging a lot of business application. They have multiple tabs open, maybe in Chrome, and they're checking their email. That's going to be what a professional worker would do in a given day. What you'll notice is this number right here, the session host count in the pool, is going to change based on the type of worker you specify. And obviously, if you've got a worker who just checks their email and that's literally it, they might be more a task worker, a knowledge worker, just a low level worker. But what we find is professional workers are pretty standard, and you're safe if you allocate professional workers. If you set that here, you're going to be pretty close to your number when you get to the end. So this is something we just recommend. By default, just go ahead and set this to pro workers. Once that's set and we have this in place, the important thing to think about here is, are you going to use a reserved instance? And if you are, how are you going to use it? Now, for those of you who don't really understand reserved instances, basically an RI is Microsoft's way of predicting the amount of data center, consumption that's going to happen on a given month or a given year. So what they do is Microsoft will reward partners if they commit to using a specific virtual machine or virtual machine series for either 1 or 3 years. And they have some pretty significant discounts. When you combine reserved instance with Azure hybrid usage, it can get up to 60 to 70%, sometimes even 80% discounts. So what I like to say is, go ahead and calculate that in here if you're going to use reserved instances. And when you do have that set, you can see that is here, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on. But in this situation, I think 3 years set by default. What we'll do is we'll set 1 year, and what you can think about is, okay, how many virtual machines are actually going to be set on the reserved instance? So if you're going to have session hosts here in the pool, let's say there's never going to be more than 8, but that you're going to need at least 6 virtual machines with 90 users leveraging a specific pool. Pretty much all the time, you're going to need to leverage those. What you do is you'd say there's never going to be less. Okay, here it looks like the max is 5. So we'll say, for the sake of argument, 5 virtual machines. We'll maintain a minimum of 5 in the pool, and it'll be no more than 8, right? And then it's going to set the VM series size. So E4SV3 is pretty great. What it has is a 1 to 8 core to memory ratio with the 4 core, 32 gigs. The D series has a 1 to 4 core to memory ratio. So if it was a D4SV3, it would be 4 core and then 16 gigs of memory. So by default, I would say you're probably pretty good running with the E4, but if you understand virtual machine series sizing and you want to get unique and make some customizations here, you could always set this as something like a D4SV3, which is obviously going to make a price adjustment there. But for the sake of this, we'll go ahead and leave it to an E4, leave it on an E4SV3. So what we find is there's really 3 ways of leveraging scale settings or reserved instances and all that. First one is 100% pay as you go. If you're not going to use reserved instance, you don't want to touch it. What you do is you'd set this to no, saying I'm not going to use a reserved instance. In that situation, you're probably going to only want 1 session host up in the pool at a period of time, and then you'd probably max out at 8. All right, that's going to allow you to, let's say during the day you need to scale out to 6 or 7 session hosts, and then it's getting close to the end of the day. Let's say it's 4 or 5 in the afternoon, users start logging off. It's going to scale all the way down to 1, but it'll leave 1 in there so that it knows, and when users log in the next day, there's at least 1 session host ready to go, and then they can power on. Now, you also have some pre-stage options. I won't get into that here, but in the Nerdio admin portal, you do have options to pre-stage virtual machines at a specific time. So if you're doing pay-as-you-go and you say, hey, I know that by the time 70 of the users log in, we're going to need at least 6 session hosts in here. At 4 a.m., you can have the Nerdio admin portal load up 6 session hosts and get them staged, so that when the users are actually logged in and ready to go, those session hosts are already set for them, and then if you need the additional 2, they can run with it. So that's fully pay as you go. You're going to leverage all the scale settings. Option 2 is you're going to use a hybrid scenario where you'd have maybe half of or you're going to anticipate that in most days you're never going to use more than 4 session hosts, but it might need to scale out to 6 or 7 in some cases. So what you're going to do is you're going to purchase reserved instances on 4 of the session hosts, and in that case here you're going to say we're going to always have 4 session hosts on, but you're never going to scale out to more than 8. And what it allows you to do is you can anticipate most of your costs in the sense that you don't have to buy a reserved instance for the 5th or the 6th VM, but if it needs to be added to the pool to allow for a good user experience, it can scale out to that if necessary. So that's kind of a hybrid pay-as-you-go versus reserved instance scenario. The final one is 100% reserved instance. In that case, you'd specify the number of session hosts you're going to have in here, and you'd say, hey, we're always going to have these on. It doesn't matter. If you do have pay-as-you-go, these rules, this next section here becomes important. Basically, it's saying the collection will be maxed out at X number of hours per week and at a minimum size of this many number of hours per week. This is basically saying if you know that the session hosts are going to start at around 8 in the morning and they're going to start scaling in at 5 in the afternoon, that's going to be a 40-hour work week, and it means that you're going to have probably 6 to 8 session hosts up and running in your pool for 40 hours throughout the week. Or if hey, the people in this environment, they work crazy hours, they're more like 12 hours a day, then obviously you can make those adjustments here, and then the minimum is going to be, okay, how many hours throughout the week is this pool going to be scaled down to its minimum capacity? So if you know that you're going to be on pay-as-you-go, these rules become important. However, if you say, what, I'm just going to stick with reserved instance, we're going to leave this at pretty much the primary there, you don't really have to pay too much attention to this line right down here. One more thing I will mention, if you're going to do pay as you go, this tab right here, desktop auto scale, you're going to go ahead and just toggle this to yes, and you'll fill in this information. So it's just going to provide a little bit more details about the users in the environment, what their work behavior is, and if you've got most of the users leveraging the pool 100% of the time, then it's good for us to know, because then we can calculate the fact that you're on pay-as-you-go and you'll be leveraging those resources. Now, something that I do like to just point out while we're here, if you look right here, you can see Azure cost $1,900 based on what we have right now. Just switching this to a 1 year, you'll see that drop by $300, and then switching it to a 3 year, you'll see it drop by another 300. So there's a pretty significant price savings when you do commit to a 3 or a 1 year reserved instance versus the pay as you go. And then when you do that as well, obviously this becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter what your scale settings are because you're going to have these virtual machines already purchased for 3 years. You can have them running at full capacity for 3 years nonstop, and it wouldn't cost you a dime more. So just something I want to point out. What we'll do now is we'll move on to just kind of back. We finished this, section 2. Let's go ahead and move to section 3. So by default, Nerdio provisions with these 3 servers on the enterprise account. We're going to have the domain controller, we're going to have a file server, and a proxy. What we found is domain controller, you can leave this as a B2 MS. That's going to be fine. The disk drive and everything looks good. The file server, we would recommend this on a D2 SV3 or a D4 SV3, just kind of as a base. And there's a few reasons why. If you have a small environment, let's say 3 to 4 users, and you don't think they're going to be power users, leaving it as a B2 MS is probably going to not hurt you at all and not provide any issues or cause latency in the environment. However, if you have more, let's say 10 users, 15 users, and they're logging in and logging out at infrequent hours, and they're using their desktops like a regular user would, they're saving files and they're doing stuff. Basically, if they're doing things on their session that would cause FS01, or in this case the file server, to have to use up some of its resources. All right, so what we found is B2 MS, or the B series virtual machines, they're great for cost savings, but because of some of the limitations Microsoft has placed on them, it can cause a lot of latency. And so a great example is credit banks. So B series in general run off credit banks. So what it does is Microsoft will give you a certain amount of credits, let's say 1,000 credits in a 24-hour time frame, and you have the option of either no users are logging in, so those resources aren't being leveraged, or let's say you have 4 or 5 users logging in, and so it starts to leverage a lot of the credits, and so you start to max out your credit limit. What happens is if you do max that credit limit out, your virtual machine performance is going to come to an absolute halt, and all the users are going to experience latency in their sessions, extended amount of times opening up files and folders, and then sign-ons and sign-offs are going to take a really long time. So our recommendation is, if you've got, like in this situation, 50 to 100 users, something like a D4 or maybe a D8 SV3 is fine on the file server. If you've got maybe 20 to 25 users, a D2 SV3 is probably fine. It's just the file server needs to have, because of the WVD orchestration and the way we're doing profile redirects from FS01, and the VHDs for those users are also getting redirected to the session hosts. You just want to make sure that this virtual machine has the resource capacity to do that elegantly without causing other users difficulty and latency in their session. So FS01 or the file server, you're definitely going to want this. In this situation with 100 users, I'm going to just go ahead and put it as a D4 SV3. The proxy here, this is only really necessary if you're in a situation where you will have a federated domain. If you've got a managed domain, you really don't need the proxy. The default domain that Nerdio provisions with is federated, and so it's important to have, and it's better to have this option than to not have it. So we provision with this. What we found is, when you provision, it'll provision with an SSD drive. If you really don't need it, let's say you got a managed domain, you can just go ahead and reduce the drive series to an HDD, and you can turn it off in the Nerdio admin portal. That's going to reduce it to deallocated in Azure, and you're just going to pay a few dollars every month for the Azure spend of the storage there. So we have partners who say, hey, can we delete that? And obviously, this is your environment, do whatever you want. Nerdio is an orchestration tool. We're not here to limit you, but our caution to you is that if you do delete that and you ever need it added back in, it turns into a very long process. There might be a lump sum involved in getting that added back in, and so our recommendation is go ahead and just turn it off. The pain and headache it'll cause to try to get that recreated would far exceed the pain and headache of the few dollars every month for the storage on the proxy. And then if you ever needed to use the Nerdio domain for testing or your own federated domain, it's available for you there. So I know that's a bit of a spiel, but a lot of people ask why we provision with the proxy by default, and that's really the reasoning behind that. Now when it comes to licensing here, I want to break this down a little bit. WVD allows you to license in two different ways. The first one is M365, and that's going to provide you with your Win 10 licensing and then also the Office suite. The second option is if you have, let's say existing Pro Plus licenses and you just want to pay the extra $7 a month or whatever it is to get the Windows 10 Enterprise licenses added onto those users, then what you can do is you can do kind of a split scenario. So the split scenario is Office with Win 10 for the WVD sign-ins, and then the other option would be just M365. If you're going to do M365 and you already have all of the licensing, then you can just say right here, customer will provide licensing, and you'll say, hey, we're going to have 25, and you'll set that as is. If for whatever reason, let's say you want to do the split scenario, basically what you're going to do is you're going to say, I'm going to sell them the licensing. Basically what you're going to see here is Windows 10. You can see Windows 10 Enterprise. It's going to calculate that in for all the users as well, and then that'll get populated there. So for our sake, let's say every user is just going to have M365. So we'll say, it's going to have 100. And so now it'll calculate the Microsoft price based on M365 being used as the primary licensing scheme there. So moving on to section 5. All right, so yeah, let's cover Azure hybrid usage and reserved instance. So I know I talked about it a little bit earlier and some of the impact it can have, but what I want to do is now jump to the Azure side, and I'm actually going to show you guys in real practicality the impact it can have on your bottom line. Okay, so we just go to Azure price calculator, and if you just Google Azure pricing calculator, it'll show you the same screen I'm seeing here, and we'll just select a virtual machine. All right, and we'll scroll down. So we've got the region set, and let's just use the D8 SV3 as an example. Okay, so remember, this is only for a specific virtual machine, and this might be one VM within a pool, and you might have 5 of these in a specific pool. So this is a very, very isolated scenario, but it does apply. You just apply this at scale to the environment, and you can see the big impact it'll have. Okay, so what we have right now is everything standard. Azure hybrid usage is off, and pay-as-you-go is not even a factor here. I mean, reserved instances are not even a factor. It's just pay-as-you-go. So given that, what we have is a monthly price of $548.96. Now, what most clients are going to say is, honestly, no thanks, appreciate the offer, but if you scale that out, that's like $6,000 a year for a single virtual machine. I mean, that's a significant amount of monthly Azure spend, and most clients, it's just not going to be worth it. They're going to stay on-prem, and they're going to walk away from the cloud solution. So seeing this, Microsoft has done everything they can to help incentivize and lower the price. So what we'll do here is we'll start with reserved instance. So if we do a 1-year reserved instance, you can see it's about a 21% savings, and it did drop it just over $100. Okay, and if we extend this to 3 years, that's going to be about another $70, $80. Okay, so already this has dropped the price fairly significantly, about 30%. Now, what you have here is when you're loading up just a VM, right? You're renting all the licensing from Microsoft. So what you have is the option of purchasing the licensing through a CSP and then providing it yourself. When you do this, you can toggle this switch, Azure Hybrid Benefits or Azure Hybrid Usage on. Look at the price savings. It dropped from about 500, 560, I believe. Yeah, 550, 548, all the way to 107. Okay, so let's pull up the calculator and we'll talk about what that actually looks like. Okay, so if we had 550 minus 107, this is your price savings on a month to month. And if you do this extended over 3 years, multiply it by 36, that means you're saving the partner or the client $15,000, almost $16,000 over a 3-year period. That's significant price savings, and it provides you the ability to offer a cloud solution that's actually competitive with on-prem solutions. Now, one thing I will point out, do not apply Azure Hybrid Usage to the B Series VM. So the B Series is really Microsoft's way of saying, hey, how can we make this as cheap as absolutely possible? So I'll use a B2MS as an example. This is what would be loaded on the domain controller. Okay, pay as you go versus reserved instance, it's still going to be about a 50%, actually more than that. You can see, I mean, that's a significant cost savings for the pay as you go if you do a 3-year. But if you toggle this on, you can see it actually only saves you $6, right? Now, MSRP for the B series, that's going to be about $500 is what you'd pay up front for the licensing. So if we just do the calculations, you're doing a $6 savings. multiplied by, let's say you do the 3-year RI, you're only going to actually save $216, and it'll cost you over $500 for the licensing. So for the B series, it actually costs more if you rent the licensing on your own and you provide it through a CSP. If you already have it, no big deal, but Microsoft's, their whole goal was to make this as absolutely dirt cheap as possible. So for the B series, that's part of the reason why they just significantly discounted the licensing there as well. And so for that, I would say just go ahead and do the reserved instance for the B series, but just don't use Azure Hybrid usage. So that's the quick overview. Let's jump back over to the price calculator here. And the rest of this is honestly pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and just cover backups next. So the difference between in-region backups and out-of-region backups. In-region backups is one full backup a day, which is just 4 VSS snapshots a day, backup retention for a minimum of 30 days on that. And then in-region backups is your data being backed up in 3 locations in a specific region, and the Microsoft SLA on that is 99.99. So they're pretty confident, your data's safe. The out-of-region backups is not only your data backed up in 3 locations, but it's also geo-replicated to 3 additional locations. So basically, you've got 6 copies, and this SLA is 99.14 of redundancy. Okay, so this is something that you probably won't need out-of-region DR unless maybe your client's like a medical practice or somebody who has other stipulations around backups. For most scenarios, the in-region backup is going to be just fine. So you just say yes to this. The next section here, VPNs. This, you're going to know if you'll need a VPN or not. This would be if you've got maybe multiple locations, or maybe there's on-prem infrastructure you need connected to Azure. The additional price here is really not bad. I think it's like $25. You can see Azure, when I toggle this to yes, yeah, it's just like, yeah, it's really not much. So we'll just say no for our situation here, but you might need it. The next thing here, hybrid AD. This, we find that people think they need this more than they actually do. There's really only 2 scenarios where we find it actually is effective and it's worth the pain of setting it up. Scenario 1 is, let's say it's a very large environment, you've got 200 plus users, and they plan on doing a phase migration. Maybe it's accounting department first, then sales, then frontline support or whatever. Given that maybe it's spread out over a 6-month period of time, they're going to need connectivity, and they're going to need to be able to see existing infrastructure on-prem and in Azure at the same time throughout the duration of the migration. In that case, hybrid AD is probably going to be necessary, and we would say let's move forward. The second option is maybe there's something on-prem and the client is very adamant that there's no way they will ever be able to migrate whatever infrastructure is on-prem into Azure. In that situation, it's also a good candidate for hybrid because it allows you to set up, connectivity between Azure and on-prem, and have the AD management in both places. Now, given that, if you decide that you're kind of on the fence and you're not sure if you really fit in either of those categories, what I would say is group lift and shift. We found that the majority of people who go through it realize it's actually way easier than they thought. Nerdio, with our integrations with Azure, and then also some other tools that we've helped build out in our scripts, make it very, very simple for you to set up to do a group lift and shift. We've streamlined a lot of the processes there, so it really is. What we found is hybrid AD only works for people who are pretty technically competent. They have an intricate understanding of their on-prem infrastructure, and there's even with that, sometimes there can be some complications. So if it sounds like I'm trying to scare you away from hybrid AD, it's kind of because I am. It definitely is an option, and we do support it, and we have engineers who can help you get it set up. But sometimes what we find is, at the end of the day, if you just ask yourself, is it really necessary? The group lift and shift option is way better for you. So given that, let's continue on. Desktop auto scale. This can be set. You can just leave this. Obviously we kind of went through this earlier. On-ramp regions. This is only in scenarios where, let's say it's a very large corporation. Your client has maybe 1,000 something users, and they have branches in maybe Japan and the center of Europe. In those situations, you probably will want to go ahead and add an on-ramp region. It's basically just going to place a node in those locations, and that is going to allow those users to connect, and it'll reduce some of the latency that would be caused if they're trying to reach halfway across the world to connect to the Azure infrastructure. So in that scenario, you would just push this, toggle this to yes. Continuing on here, bandwidth. The rest of these guys is pretty simple. It looks a lot more scary than it actually is. Bandwidth is very, very cheap in Azure right now. I mean, it's like 1.5 per user per month, and then maybe $3 for graphic intensive users. It's really not much. If you're doing core, I'll just jump up there and switch real quick. Bandwidth, you can see I've set this at, this is set at 50. By default, I believe the Nerdio has 100 in here. Bandwidth, basically the way that this is calculated is you really only pay by egress bandwidth. What that means is downloads are free, uploads cost money, right? So the question is like, how much does the client really need to upload on a month-to-month basis? I mean, a terabyte is probably way more than you need. I'd say go ahead and put this at 50, and in reality it's probably going to be more like 10. So not that you'd save a whole lot in the sense that you know, it's already dirt cheap, but you don't need to overestimate that much. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're calculating costs there. And switching between core and enterprise, reset our calculator a little bit here. So I'm just going to enter in the values again, bringing us back to square one. Okay, perfect. So continuing on, the next thing you want to do is specify the personal desktop VM size. This is going to be for the dedicated desktops. Depending on the user, either a D4 or a D2 SV3 should be fine. If there's, you know, graphic intensive users or power users, obviously you're going to want to ask them a little more questions about their use case and maybe do some digging into the VM series size and figure out what's going to fit right for them. But a D2 or a D4 SV3 should be fine. Moving along, Azure CSP discount. You guys are going to obviously know this more than I will, just for your own situation. We found that generally there's going to be anywhere from a 7 to a 12% discount on the Azure resources, and then with the O365 licensing and stuff, sometimes up to like a 16%. But I would say, you know, as a rule of thumb, you can never go wrong underestimating. So I'll just put 5 in there. And for reserved instance, to be honest, it's very rare that a CSP will discount this, and if they do, it's like 1 or 2%. The reason is because Microsoft already has it so discounted that it doesn't really make sense to discount it further. So you can obviously adjust this if you want, but not really necessary. Given that, the last 2 sections here are just Azure regions, so you can select where you're going to be provisioning, and then obviously the location. One thing I will mention before we move on, just related to reserved instance, the Microsoft does allow partners the ability to get out of a 3-year or a 1-year reserved instance contract, and the way they calculate it in is you basically just pay 12% of the remainder of the contract, right? So let's say it's 3 years and you're 1 year in and you've got 2 years left, and the partner wants to adjust their VM series size, or you're making some changes, you basically just pay 12% of the 2 years that are left in the contract. Now, we say that Microsoft uses that as a threat, but we actually really haven't seen them enforce that yet. So obviously you don't want to make calculations hoping that Microsoft doesn't enforce that and calculate and provision frivolously. But there are most situations we haven't seen them enforce it. So it's just good for you guys to know that when you do select a 1 or a 3 year, you're not actually locked into that. You're not signing away your firstborn child or whatever. There are ways to get out of it. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and view cost. So what it's going to do is just give you this final number here. It'll look nice. You can see it's broke down into different sections, and then everything is also kind of itemized down here below. And so you can see, what discounts were applied, what region you're going to be provisioning in, what are some of the different numbers broke down for you in case you wanted to know how it really is separated. Now, if you get to the end and you're like, hey, this is more than I was hoping, I would say just go ahead and maybe go through the cost estimator and strategize in some ways that you might be able to save further. Like, for instance, here you can see, we only have 1 virtual machine on a reserved instance and then 7 on the pay-as-you-go. If you're like, okay, well, I want 4 on reserved instance, kind of like we mentioned before, you want to use a hybrid scenario, you basically select this, move it to 4, and then let's go ahead and view cost, and you can see, okay, now we have 4 on the 3-year reserved instance, and it lowered the Azure cost. So, there are ways to adjust things here to kind of help you if you feel like maybe it's going to be a little bit more expensive and your client is not going to like it. I mean, obviously, like here as an example, I didn't even toggle AHU, I didn't even turn that on, and you saw how much of an impact that made. So there are ways to adjust things. If you have questions, you get to the end of your cost estimations and your quotes and you feel like it's just not right, or you want a second pair of eyes, obviously guys, go ahead and reach out to your Nerdio PSC rather. they'd be more than happy to help you look over things and get you squared away. So, all right, well, that sums up this video. Good luck quoting.